Imagine a clay pot unearthed in Tokyo. Inside, not treasure, but the skeletons of two young men. The bones aren't broken, they are sectioned. The spine is severed in 7 distinct places, with clean, smooth facets, as if sliced by a machine of impossible sharpness. A forensic report from Japan's National Museum of Nature and Science classifies these wounds not as combat injuries, but as cut-off marks from systematic testing. This wasn't murder, it was calibration. But what kind of weapon requires such a gruesome test? And why were these bodies chosen? The answers expose a brutal reality hidden behind the myth of samurai honor. A world so violent, it created the need for an even darker warrior, the shinobi. Mainstream history shows you the glorious battles, but it omits the cold, methodical horror that happened after. To understand the forbidden secrets of the ninja, you must first witness the world that forged them. Join us as we follow the forensic evidence back to a truth more disturbing than any legend. The year was 1988, the site of former temple cemetery in Yushima, Tokyo. As construction crews dug into the earth, they found them. The remains of a man in his mid-20s and a boy, barely a teenager. In the sterile quiet of a forensic lab, the full story began to emerge, and it was a story of chilling precision. The skull of the older man was pierced by 2 holes, what the report calls notched defects. One measured 22.5 by 17.5 millimeters, the other 22.4 by 11.6 millimeters. The analysis was clear. These wounds were not made by a sword. They were made by something else, something narrow and double-edged, consistent with a Japanese spear. But the real horror was found in the torso. The spine and rib cage had been completely severed by at least 7 separate horizontal cuts. These weren't the chaotic marks of a battle. They were clean, ordered, and exact. This was the work of a master, but it wasn't an execution. The evidence pointed to an inescapable conclusion. After these 2 were killed, their bodies were used as a test bed. A practice dummy. A piece of equipment to test the cutting power of newly forged blades in a procedure known as tameshi-giri. These bones don't tell a story of war, they tell a story of practice. To understand how 2 young men ended up as a whetstone for a blade, you have to understand the world that created them. A world of absolute power and the terrifying tools used to maintain it. A world where honor was a performance, and the real work was done in the shadows. That world of cold, practiced violence seems a universe away from the Japan we think we know, the Japan of legend. A land of poets and warriors where honor was the highest virtue. Picture the samurai Towai. Clad in brilliant armor, lacquered plates of silk and steel gleaming in the sun. We see them composing poetry under cherry trees or facing a single opponent in a duel of lethal grace. This is the image of Bushido, the way of the warrior, loyalty unto death, glory in open combat, and an honor so pristine it was worth dying for. It's a powerful story, a beautiful story, and it is a lie. The Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, was not an era of honorable duels. It was a century of total, unrelenting warfare. A meat grinder that consumed generations. The great warlords, the daimyo, were not poets concerned with glory. They were pragmatists obsessed with power. And they knew that honor doesn't win a war that's fought in every shadow, in every rice paddy. The historical records, even the ones that romanticize the samurai, are filled with accounts of ambush, of night attacks, of deception. In 1160, a force of 500 men attacked the Sanjo Palace in the dead of night, setting it ablaze and kidnapping 2 emperors. In 1557, the great Oda Nobunaga himself faked a mortal illness to lure his own brother to his bedside, only to rise up and plunge a dagger into his heart. This was the reality, a world where victory was the only virtue. To win. The great lords needed men who weren't bound by the performance of honor. They needed a different kind of tool, one they could use for the tasks too dirty, too dishonorable for a samurai to admit to. For every celebrated charge on the battlefield, there was a need for a quiet knife in the dark, a rumor spread in a marketplace, a castle burned from within. The honorable lie of the samurai could only be maintained by outsourcing the dishonorable truth. But who were these men? Who were the shadows that allowed the samurai to stand in the sun? To find these shadow warriors, you have to look past the legends and into the margins of the official histories, into the words the samurai themselves used. And the first thing you must do is forget the word ninja. That name, as we know it, wouldn't be established for centuries. The earliest chronicles use a much simpler and much more telling term: shinobi. It's a word that appears in the 14th century war epic, the Taiheki, to describe a skilled agent setting fire to a shrine to create chaos. But in earlier periods, the word shinobi wasn't a job title. It was a synonym for an act of theft. The first secret is that the original shadow warriors were seen as little more than thieves. The samurai lords who hired them used a whole vocabulary of contempt to keep them at a distance. They were called kusa, or grass, agents who would hide in the foliage to spy, something to be trampled underfoot. They were called supa, which means liar, a name for those with inconsistent behavior, men you couldn't trust. And they were called rappa, or rowdy breakers. Agents used to create noisy distractions and sow confusion. These weren't a rival warrior class. They were recruited from the fringes of society, bandits, robbers, and outlaws whose violent skills were useful, but whose very existence was officially despised. The historical records are unflinching on this point. The powerful Hojo clan employed a notorious group of rappa under a commander named Kazama. These agents were so infamously ill-mannered, so prone to violence, that when they were sent to stay in Allied territory, advance warnings had to be sent to the villages, instructing them on how to handle the outrages these men were expected to commit, even against their own side. This was the reality. A disposable underclass of thugs and spies hired to do the dirty work that would stain a samurai's honor. They were a tool, nothing more. But in two remote mountainous provinces, this ad hoc practice of hiring criminals would evolve into something far more organized, something so effective it would build a nation of its own, and in doing so, sign its own death warrant. The mountains of central Japan are a fortress of stone and mist, a labyrinth of steep valleys, dense forests, and winding passes that swallow armies whole. It was in this rugged, inaccessible terrain in the provinces of Iga and Koka that the scattered, despised shinobi began to coalesce into something new, something dangerous. While the rest of the country was being violently consolidated under the iron fist of powerful warlords, these provinces remained stubbornly, defiantly independent. In an age of tyrants, this place was different. It was not ruled by a single lord. Instead, the land was controlled by confederations of local, land-owning warrior families, the Jizumarai. They called their self-governing councils Iki, or leagues. The most powerful of these, the Iga Sokoku Iki, was essentially a republic of warriors, a democratic body in an era of absolute feudalism. They were not isolationists. The historical record shows that as early as 1487, the leagues of Iga and Koka were fighting side by side, a formal military alliance against outside threats. Surrounded by enemies, forced to defend their unique freedom, these families perfected a new way of war. Not the way of grand armies and honorable charges, but of ghosts and rumors, of sabotage and fear. Their geographic isolation and political autonomy created a crucible, forging the scattered skills of espionage and guerrilla fighting into a codified art form: ninjutsu. They were no longer just mercenaries for hire. They were a sovereign power with a military doctrine unlike any other in Japan. This independence, this radical experiment in self-rule, was not just an anomaly. It was a threat. And it was a threat that the great unifiers of Japan could not afford to ignore. That independent republic, that nation of shadows, could not be allowed to exist on the doorstep of a would-be god. The clash was inevitable. It came in 1579, not at the hands of the great unifier himself, but of his ambitious second son, Oda Nobukatsu. Eager to prove his own worth and expand his domain, Nobukatsu decided to conquer Iga. Acting without his father's permission, he assembled a grand army of 8,000 to 10,000 samurai and marched on the province from 3 directions. It was supposed to be a simple conquest, a young lord's chance to earn his spurs. He marched his gleaming army into the hills of Iga, expecting to fight soldiers. Instead, he was dismantled by ghosts. The Iga warriors knew he was coming. They had watched his preparations, tracked his movement. They did not meet him on the field of battle. They waited. As Nobukatsu's main force snaked its way through the claustrophobic confines of the Nagano Pass, the world erupted. From the trees, from the rocks, from the very ground itself, the attack came. The Iga forces used their intimate knowledge of the terrain, the darkness, the fear in their enemies' own hearts, to turn the pass into a slaughterhouse. Nobukatsu's army, confused and panicked, broke and fled. The campaign was a complete and utter disaster. Thousands of his men were cut down. One of his top generals, Tsugesaburo, was killed. The defeat was so total, so humiliating, that when his father, Oda Nobunaga, learned of the unauthorized invasion, he became enraged and threatened to disown his son. In one brilliant, bloody ambush, the Iga Ikki had done the impossible. They had proven that their way of war, the way of the shinobi, was a viable threat to the most powerful military machine in Japan. It was their greatest victory, and it would be their last, for in proving their strength, they had just guaranteed their own annihilation. That victory in the Nagano Pass was the proudest moment in the history of the Iga Republic. It was also a death sentence. For 2 years, Oda Nobunaga let his anger simmer. The humiliation of his son was an insult he could not abide, but this was more than family pride. The existence of a free, self-governing state on his border, one that had proven it could defeat his armies, was a cancer that had to be cut out. On September 30th, 1581, he returned. Not with an army, but with an apocalypse. 42,000 Some records say nearly 50,000 men, a force nearly equal to half the entire population of Iga. A tide of steel and fire that poured into the province from 6 directions at once. Against them stood, at most, 10,000 scattered defenders, with some accounts placing the number as low as just several thousand. The orders were simple: leave nothing standing. This wasn't a war. It was a scouring. Nobunaga's forces advanced, and the chronicles of his life, the Shinshokoki and the Aranki, record what happened next with cold, dispassionate detail. They torched everything: castles, Buddhist temples, Shinto shrines, entire villages. The smoke choked the valleys for days. The Iga warriors made their last desperate stands at Hijiyama and Kashiwara castles. But they were simply overwhelmed, drowned by sheer numbers. By October 8th, it was over. By the time the fires died down, the land was a smoldering ruin. One contemporary account states that half the population of Iga province had been wiped from the face of the earth. And here lies the most terrifying secret of all. This wasn't just revenge for a military defeat. This was an ideological purge. Nobunaga wasn't just destroying an army. He was erasing a form of self-governance that challenged his vision of a unified Japan. The free Republic of Iga had to die, and its people had to be slaughtered to make an example, to prove that no other way of life would be tolerated. The people were gone. Their nation was ash. But what of their tools? What of the weapons they forged in their desperate fight for freedom? In the scorched earth of their castles, archaeologists would later find the first clues: the primitive origins of the ninja's famous arsenal. The legends speak of fantastic weapons, an arsenal of exotic tools forged in secret. But recent archaeology, a re-examination of artifacts pulled from the mud and ruin of Sengoku period castles, tells a different story, a grittier story. In the ruins of sites associated with the Hojo clan, active during the same era as the Iga Wars, archaeologists have found the primitive ancestors of the ninja's most iconic tools. At Iwatsuki Castle, they found a single, hexagonal piece of sharpened stone, just under 4.8 centimeters across and a centimeter thick. This isn't the perfectly balanced, razor-sharp steel star of the movies. This is a rock, deliberately shaped to be thrown. It is a proto-shuriken, a weapon of improvisation. And it wasn't alone. At a nearby administrative site, 17 similar, slightly larger, sharpened stones were recovered. The evidence is even more stark at Hachioji Castle. During an excavation in 1960, 4 small, unglazed clay balls were found in the rubble. Each one, measuring between 1 and 3 centimeters, has 4 crude points sticking out. They are unmistakable precursors to the sharp metal makibishi, or caltrops used to lame the horses of charging samurai. But these aren't metal. They're baked clay. Experts believe they were likely mass-produced in a panic by the castle's defenders during the final, overwhelming siege. These artifacts strip away the myth. They show us that the famous ninja arsenal didn't spring into existence as the expertly crafted tools of a secret society. It began as the last-ditch effort of a people facing annihilation, sharpened rocks and baked clay spikes, the weapons of the desperate. But this creates a disturbing new question. If these were the kinds of crude, improvised tools used in guerrilla warfare, then what created the wounds we saw in the bone room? What kind of blade leaves a cut so clean it can section a human spine 7 times? The tools of the desperate don't match the evidence of the dead. To find the answer, we have to go back to those bones and look closer at the world of the blade that made them. And now, we return to the bone room, to the 2 young men in the clay pot. The forensic report, hidden away in academic journals for years, reads like a horror story. And it reveals the final, brutal secret of the samurai world. The crude weapons of the desperate do not match the evidence of the dead. The cuts on these bones are too clean, too precise. The analysis begins with the skull. The 2 notched defects, one measuring 22.5 by 17.5 millimeters, the other 22.4 by 11.6 millimeters, were not made by a sword. The forensic conclusion is chillingly specific. The wounds are consistent with a narrow, double-edged, sharp instrument, likely a Japanese spear, a yari, being tested on the victim's head after death wound. But the true revelation lies in the torso. The skeleton of the older man was subjected to at least 7 distinct horizontal cuts that completely severed his spine and rib cage. These are not the random slashes of a fight. They are perfectly spaced, unwavering lines of force. And their locations are not random. The cuts on the vertebrae correspond with meticulous precision to the target diagrams in Kaihu Kenjiaku, a well-known Edo period manual on the practice of tameshi-giri, sword testing. The conclusion is undeniable. After being executed, the bodies of these 2 young men were used as a medium to demonstrate the cutting power of newly forged blades. The presence of identical wounds on the younger skeleton suggests something even more ghastly. Their corpses were likely stacked one on top of the other to be cut through with a single stroke, a technique known as kasane-giri, the ultimate test of a sword's quality. The soul of the samurai, the legendary katana, was not just a weapon of honor. Its lethal efficiency was calibrated on human corpses. This was the world the shinobi navigated, a world where even the dead were just another tool to be used and discarded. In a world this brutal, where even the most sacred symbols were polished with blood, What happened when the wars finally ended? Who got to write the history? And what lies would they tell to cover up the truth? With their homeland destroyed and their way of life erased, the survivors of Iga scattered across Japan, selling their skills to the highest bidder. But as the Sengoku period bled into the long enforced peace of the Tokugawa shogunate, their specialized arts became obsolete. The age of war was over. So how does a shadow warrior prove their worth when there are no more shadows to fight in? You write a resume, a very, very impressive resume. This is the hidden truth behind the great ninja manuals, the so-called Bibles of ninjutsu. They were not written in the heat of battle, but decades, even centuries later, in a desperate attempt to preserve a dying tradition and secure employment. The most famous, the Bansen Shukai, was compiled in 1676, nearly a century after the fall of Iga. It's a massive encyclopedia, 22 volumes covering everything from philosophy to explosives, but its true purpose is revealed in a historical record from 1789, when a group of unemployed Koka samurai, complaining of their difficult situation, formally presented a copy to the government in an appeal for work. It was a marketing document. 5 years later, in 1681, another manual appeared, the Shoninki, a more focused treatise on the practical arts of espionage and psychological discipline. But the most audacious of these scrolls, the one that claims the most direct link to the age of war, is the Ninpidden. It is said to have been written in 1560 by the most legendary ninja of all, Hattori Hanzo. If true, it would be the only genuine Sengoku period manual among them. But the academic consensus is clear. It's a fake. There are no original copies, only transcriptions riddled with errors and conflicting dates, ranging from 1560 to 1733. The real forensic evidence lies within the text itself. It is filled with what experts call outright nonsense. In its description of the kama, a sickle-like weapon, it gives measurements that are monstrously wrong, dimensions that would render the weapon completely unusable. We know this because legitimate martial schools from the period have scrolls with the correct dimensions, and surviving physical examples confirm the Ninpidden's error. The document is a forgery, likely created around 1733 to cash in on a growing legend, slapping a famous name and a fake date on it to give it a false air of authenticity. These scrolls are not unaltered windows into the past. They are the beginning of the myth, but if the texts themselves are part of the invention. Where did the most iconic image of all, the black-clad assassin, come from? The answer is not in any secret scroll. It's somewhere far more public. So if the scrolls are complicated, where did the image we all know come from? The black suit, the mask. Where is it in the historical record? The answer is nowhere. It comes from the theater. During the peaceful Edo period, the skills of the shinobi found a new home in entertainment, particularly in the wildly popular kabuki theater. As plays began to feature ninja characters, directors needed a way to visually signal stealth to the audience. They found their solution in a long-standing stage convention. Kabuki stage hands, known as kuroko, would dress entirely in black from head to toe. By theatrical tradition, the audience understood them to be invisible, allowing them to move props and scenery without breaking the illusion of the play. To make the ninja characters instantly recognizable as figures of stealth, they were simply dressed in the same all-black costume. The image was born not from history, but from stagecraft. The historical reality was the complete opposite. A shinobi's greatest skill was not to be an invisible shadow, but to hide in plain sight. The manuals describe the shichi-hode, or the 7 disguises, where an agent would adopt the persona of a common figure, a traveling priest, a merchant, a street performer, a peasant, to move through enemy territory and gather information without attracting any attention at all. For night operations, the clothing of choice was never black, which actually stands out against a moonlit or starlit sky. Instead, they wore the dark navy blue-dyed working clothes of a farmer or laborer. This color provided far better camouflage in low light, and according to period beliefs, the indigo dye was also thought to repel vipers and insects. The iconic black suit is a fiction, a piece of theatrical shorthand that has completely eclipsed the truth. But the costume was only the first step. The stage gave the ninja his look, but it was another, more modern form of entertainment that would give him his superpowers. The stage gave the ninja his look, but popular fiction gave him his superpowers. As Japan entered the 20th century, a new era of mass media dawned, and with it came a hunger for new kinds of heroes. The grim, pragmatic shinobi of the Sengoku period was about to be reborn one last time, not as a spy or a saboteur, but as a superhero. The transformation was completed by a character who, to this day, is the most famous ninja in the world, Sarutobi Sasuke. His name means monkey jump, a title earned for his incredible, almost supernatural agility. He is the leader of the legendary Sanada 10 Braves, a master of magic, and a hero to generations of Japanese children. He is also completely, utterly fictional. There is no primary source documentation from the Sengoku period for a historical Sarutobi Sasuke. He was created for a series of wildly popular children's adventure books called the Tachikawa Bunko, or Tachikawa Pocketbooks, published between 1911 and 1925. These cheap, accessible books were a sensation. The 40th volume, featuring Sarutobi Sasuke, was so popular that it created a nationwide ninjutsu boom. For the first time, the ninja was not a shadowy villain or a desperate mercenary, but a heroic figure for a modern audience. The stories gave him superhuman strength, the ability to ride on clouds, conjure the elements, and transform into animals. While some historians have speculated that Sasuke may have been loosely inspired by real-life figures, the character as we know him is a 20th century invention, a composite of folklore, theatrical conventions, and pure imagination. This was the final layer of the myth. The historical shinobi's magic was a deep understanding of chemistry for explosives and smoke bombs, and meditative techniques to focus the mind, not spells to command the elements. Their incredible physical feats were the result of a lifetime of brutal, relentless training, not supernatural power. The invention of Sarutobi Sasuke completed the transformation. The historical reality of the desperate guerrilla fighter, the despised outlaw, the unemployed mercenary writing embellished resumes was now fully buried. In its place stood a superhero, ready for the silver screen. And so the stage was set for the final and perhaps most forbidden secret of all, that the ninja we know is not a historical figure to be discovered, but a modern ghost we invented ourselves. So what is the forbidden secret of the ninja clans? It's that the figure we know is a fiction, a ghost created to hide a much darker truth. The historical shinobi was a disposable tool of the powerful, a brutal necessity in a brutal time. When they were no longer needed, their communities were exterminated, and their history was rewritten. First as a legend, in the embellished scrolls of their unemployed descendants, then as a theatrical trope in the black costume of the kabuki stage hand, then as a superhero in the pages of children's books that gave us Sarutobi Sasuke, and finally as entertainment exported to the world as a pop culture icon. The journey is complete. The desperate guerrilla fighter hiding in the mountains of Iga has been replaced by a global brand. The sharpened rock found in the ruins of a castle has been replaced by a perfectly machined throwing star. The truth of the extermination of an entire people has been replaced by a fun, heroic myth. The story of the ninja is a perfect case study in how uncomfortable truths are buried by convenient fictions. It reveals our deep fascination with the shadows, but also our willingness to accept the story we want to be true over the one that is. We prefer the superhero to the desperate mercenary. We prefer the magic to the grim reality of a world where human bodies were used to test the sharpness of a blade. The shadows are always there, woven into the fabric of history. But what we choose to see in them, that tells us more about ourselves than it ever will about the ninja.